Well, with respect to the high and low income kids, granted, most of our focus was on middle to upper middle class youth, but we did focus to some degree on lower income youth. And we did find this sense of parental protection and also the risk aversion spanned socioeconomic class. In my own work with young people, I do find somewhat of a difference between the support that kids from low-income backgrounds get from their parents and their family members in general with respect to using technology in more sophisticated ways. I find that it's corroborated by other researchers that it tends to be the middle and higher income kids who get that real support of creating with and producing with digital media, and that's what some scholars, including Henry Jenkins, call the new digital divide. So we did find evidence for that, but a lot of the other differences we found they crossed income brackets.
Okay, first question right here.
Okay, thank you. Of course, Howard, I'm the same generation as you, that's clear. So your point about kids or young students being less risk takers these days really was troubling, because the immediate thing I thought of was politics and political change. So I can't conceive of how we could get political change if kids don't take risks. I mean, that's all we did in the 60s was one political thing after another, more or less. And, even at the risk of getting kicked out of school, even kicked out of Harvard or whatever. So I don't know, could you say something about whether you looked at political issues at all and political change? But even in the areas of art or academics, I mean, as far as I can see after doing a lot of research, you can't make a name for yourself, you can't have any new ideas if you don't challenge other people's ideas, and if you don't take risks in criticizing, it seems to me you're nowhere.
Well, you're raising a question which maybe should be a new research agenda for Katie and me or for other people. And that is, I think young people are perfectly willing to take risks if they're told it's okay, which of course means it's not the same kind of risk. So you may have read recently about how colleges are now asking people to write applications to show how creative they are. And you can be sure that the same super app parents who are helping kids write the application that might have worked 20 years ago will be helping kids write very original, clever kinds of things, but it will be mandated risk. And I think whether you look at Silicon Valley or Hollywood or Wall Street, there's plenty of risk-taking as long as something you're told it's okay. I mean, the lesson at Wall Street, I think, is do anything you can as long as you're not going to end up in jail. I think the more individual, the more ipsative kind of risk, where you step out alone, I agree with you. I think that's less likely. That's why I said I thought there'd be more middle C creativity, but possibly less of the big C. But I could well be wrong about this. We just don't know enough.
Next question.
Hi, my name is Ben, and as a child I grew up with an Encyclopedia Britannica in the living room, and I had a fair amount of confidence that when I looked at something it was fairly accurate. It seems like Wikipedia has replaced that today, and it's kind of an ongoing series of drafts where some of the content is accurate and some is not accurate. So my question is this access of kind of evolving content something that's looked at by younger people in a critical way, or is it just viewed as, here's the entry, I'm going to accept the data? And just in a related joiner to the question is, if we look at apps like news content, we could look at a Fox News app or an MSNBC app and be channeled towards a type of information depending on what we subscribe to. But if we also look at Twitter or other social media, we could get a very ground-up view of information. So even though there's channeled news that's very ideologically driven or ground-up information, are younger people looking at news in a ground-up way or more from a top-down perspective? So questions about critical analysis and then whether people are seeing it from the ground up or bottom down in general. Thank you.
Well, I think actually there a lot of it depends on the type of education they're getting, the type of media literacy education they're getting. And I think it's developmental as well. So in conversations with younger, we didn't go much below 10 years old when we were doing our studies, but for the younger kids, the middle school kids, really unless they're really getting a very explicit media literacy education, they pretty much, especially if a news story has a picture associated with it, well, a picture can't lie, right? So they kind of take that at face value. I think once you start getting into late high school, early college, there is more of a wariness. But there's the other thing is there's so much information out there, and there's sometimes not enough time to be highly critical. And Wikipedia is often the first and often the last stop. So even though young people may be getting the education, just having to kind of triage their information, and they kind of take what they first get. I don't know if you want to add on to that particular point before getting onto the bottom-up versus...
Go ahead.
Oh, well, so your other question was about the bottom-up versus the filtering. And that one, I don't know that we have really looked at very carefully, but there is a lot of sense that young people, also all of us really, were getting our information kind of passed on to us through Facebook and through Twitter, and not necessarily being very critical of the original source. And this has been written about by Eli Pariser, the idea of the filter bubble, and just sort of we read the news that our friends send to us, and that kind of reinforces because we all like the same things, and and they're actually in our book we actually have a lot of citations that support both the filter bubble scenario, but also the other scenario where there's more, it's more yeasty, and that there's a chance to find viewpoints that aren't necessarily like your own. And unfortunately, there's quite a bit of research supporting both, so it's not particularly conclusive.
For people who haven't thought about this as much as you have, I think the things that surprises us is, number one, that there's no longer a sense that there's a few authoritative media, and also a term which I just learned recently, so much of our access to what's happening in the world now is asynchronous. That is, we don't learn about it at the same time. We learn about it whenever somebody decides to pass it on to us. My feeling about the general problem space you talked about is, in many ways, this is the best of time, because everything comes out now. There are no secrets anymore. But as Katie says, you have to care enough to probe and to interrogate, and not just to listen to one bubble and one silo. And that's very, nobody's born with that inclination. That's really what liberal arts education is supposed to be about. And for various reasons, liberal arts education is kind of in jeopardy now. And I think a desire to get to the bottom of things will be lost if we don't have the engagement with text and argument, which happens when you're not just trying to, get the next job.
I'll just add one quick point also that I just thought of, is that I think right now for all of us there is sort of a reliance and almost an idealization of crowdsourcing ideas, and so if enough people confirm it or tweet about it, then it must be true. And we saw in Hurricane Sandy that there was a lot of misinformation that spread that way. So I do think that that is a danger today.
We also saw in Hurricane Sandy a kind of digital divide where, for example, places where there were a lot of tweets, like Manhattan, tended to have power, whereas places like the Jersey Shore, where there were a lot of problems, didn't have a lot of tweets, because, there's this, in a natural disasters, there's often a digital divide, so using Twitter or using internet activity as your indication of where the real distress was turned out not to be so reliable. Next question.
Thank you. I'm a fan of proverbs, many of which are valid generation after generation. Two of my favorite in my teens and 20s were "Note se auton," know thyself, and "To thine own self be true, every heart vibrates to that iron spring." My question to you, I guess, is, my biggest concern, I have sons in their 20s, is that with all the app stuff going on, folks aren't thinking about who they are and what they stand for as much as they used to, maybe, or should. Any thoughts on that?
Well, this is related a little bit to my allusion to liberal arts. Knowing yourself and being true to yourself make a lot of sense within the Western context, whether it's going back to Socrates or to the great writers like Shakespeare. It's not a universal goal, and societies vary a lot in the extent to which identity is collective and group as opposed to being individual or even hyper-individual. My own biases, like yours, I don't know whether I would have picked out those quotations, but I figure you live once and you ought to know as much about yourself as you can and know as much about the world as you can. But those are both not universal goals. I mean, many people are happy not to differentiate themselves from others, and many people are very happy to just, watch the boob tube. So there definitely value judgments here.
And, well, I would also add that, even your teacher, Erickson, he spoke about the social nature of identity development, and there is a role to be played for getting feedback from an audience to help you craft your identity. The concern is that when that becomes the only focus and that there's no more focus internally, and that's when the balance starts to get out of whack a little. And so we're not saying that just completely you should be looking inside yourself without any regard to other people or your audience, but there is a balance, and in some respects we see that it is a little bit out of whack right now with such a focus externally.
There are more and more apps available every day, and I have a two-part question related to that. One is, do you have an opinion? Are young people trying out and searching and looking at new apps on their own, or do they tend to wait till their peers or friends mention something? And then related to that, do they explore new apps, and does that give them a familiarity or a knowledge of some fields or things they might not otherwise have done, or again, do they tend to stay with the familiar and what their peers do?
I would say by and large, it's very much peer-driven, but that doesn't, there are always those certain peers that start and they find those apps. But by and large, young people, especially the apps that they use day to day, and especially the social ones that they use to communicate with their friends, those ones are very much peer-driven. But searching for art apps and game apps, certainly that is more individualistic, and they do stumble on new apps. So there's a little bit of both going on, but I would say that the social ones are certainly more peer-driven.
This allows me to make a more general point, which we make in the book, is that there are at least three players in whether you become dependent or enabled. One is the people who devise the apps. Katie tells me that Apple is particularly strict in the apps that it develops. Then, when you're young, how your parents and teachers and other respected older or more powerful people, how they use apps and how they navigate their life, how super app their life is. But in the end, it's up to you how you decide to use things, how dependent you are, how exploratory you are. I mean, I find with my own kids, they try things out and they don't have to wait to somebody else to do it. But as Katie says, that's probably never been the majority thing. But since we're very worried in the book about people becoming overly dependent on the apps that happen to exist and that are often devised by people who just want you to buy something, that the obligation of culture is to provide models of not being completely app-dependent and of showing how you can both, as we say, use the device to get there, but then put it aside and look around with your own eyes and ears and make your own decisions, not what the next leg of the app suggests.
What do you see or have heard anecdotally in terms of Facebook? Is there any sort of a backlash or moving away? I mean, Facebook has said recently that they actually don't see the same number of younger teens joining that they once did. Is that a trend or is that a blip?
Oh, yeah, no, that's a definite trend that is, well, when Facebook admits it, it's been a trend for a while. The Pew Center has come out with data showing that, and that this is what I see definitely in my interviews with kids, is that they're all still on Facebook, but all the activity there and their hearts are not on Facebook. So they're really, and actually it's quite fragmented now, what the young people's social media lives. So I'll have, recently, just a few weeks ago, I did a series of focus groups with kids who went to the same school but were using different social media sites. Some of them were on Instagram, some of them were on Tumblr, and the ones on Tumblr hadn't heard of Instagram, and the ones on Instagram hadn't heard of Tumblr. So right now it is quite fragmented. But who knows, if it'll cohere and converge on one particular one in a few months or a year.
Yeah, a big motivation is to move to a medium where your parents are. And I
Are not.
right. Sorry, slip.
When you get a friend request from your grandmother, it's time to move on.
And Emily Weinstein explained to me the other day that now, in addition to tweeting, there's subtweeting, where there's a text that you write that anybody older won't understand because you're actually sending a secret message. And this is the whole notion of disruption, which is in a way a blessing because it means nothing so far has been completely hegemonic.
But of course, Facebook owns Instagram, and
You sort of answered my question, which was, or is, what are some of the factors that distinguish whether any given adolescent is going down the path of app-enabled versus app-dependent? And as a parent of two teenagers, are teenagers who are all digital natives now sort of all doomed to be in the app-dependent category? Or is it possible to talk about, is it some inner resilience? I mean, I understand that watching what the parents do and some of the obvious things, but I'm just curious. I guess I want some hope for my kids.
I think something that might be telling is what happens when their phone dies. What do they do? And, when my phone dies or I forget it in the car or something, I am a little panicked at first, but I think I recover. I like to think I recover fairly quickly. But I think it really does come down to how willing are they to put away their devices, and what do they do when those devices are put away? Can they fend for themselves and look within themselves and have that inner resilience? And I'm actually fairly heartened. In a lot of the conversations I have with teens, I ask them to think about what their lives would be like without all of these technologies. And at first, especially when they're in a big group, they just freak out and they can't imagine. But then they really express strong ambivalence toward technology, which often surprises adults that I talk with who think, just kids are in love with their devices. But they experience this pressure to be always on, always responsive to their friends. And they say, well, without this, as long as everyone else was also without, because they wouldn't want to be left out, then it might give them a little bit more space to focus on their friendships one at a time, to work on their homework or just to chill out. And so I think that sentiment is a very heartening one, and one that I think we can tap into.
Okay, so I realize that in this day and age, still, it's difficult to just hop into the DeLorean and go back to 1885 to see how people lived. But I was wondering if you've taken a look, at going back in time in literature, at some of the various critiques there have been over the ages of sociologically impactful inventions, everything from television, radio in modern times, to bookbinding, the written word. Even there were criticisms that the written word would sap people's memorization communication capabilities in those times. If you've taken a look at some of those criticisms, and then in retrospect, whether those panned out to be real things that negatively impacted or positively impacted the human condition, and compared some of these modern criticisms to the more older ones.
Well, in the chapter of the book which nobody reads, I discuss that issue. And in fact, in the first draft, it was much longer. But let me just give you a couple of thoughts. Number one, I do think the digital revolution is as major as the invention of writing and the invention of printing. It is that big. And unlike the earlier ones, we can see the effects within a lifetime. It took centuries to understand the impact of the invention of writing and the invention of printing. I think with the digital media are so different from radio, TV, and so on, is those were basically passive media. They gave you stuff, but these are active media. Everybody wants to involve. This is to be involved actively creating stuff. It's incredibly new, and one of the interesting things that's already been shown is when you ask people to remember something, they don't remember it anymore. They remember the process they used to find it out. That's a huge difference. So while you're right, people have always pulled their hair out, dating back to Plato with the invention of writing. This doesn't mean that writing changed everything, and print changed everything. And I'll put my meager reputation on the line. The digital media are changing everything.
Let me just do a follow-up to that. Eric Mazur, who teaches physics at Harvard and has really tried to rethink teaching and how you teach in an effective way, has said that, students used to say to him, can I bring in, notes to a test? Oh, can I bring in my book to my test? Oh, can I bring in, a piece of technology? And one of the things that he said is, if you're asking a question on a test, and this is very different from tests 50 or 60 years ago, potentially, if you're asking a question on a test that somebody can Google, it's a bad question. So I wonder if it's possible that the good thing about technology is where it's pushing us to ask things that are not just rote, because that's too easy.
I think that's a great point. I think that with the rise of the MOOCs, and all of us who are teachers from any age are going to have to do a lot more to show our mettle, and I think that's all to the good. Interesting, though, we're doing a big study of liberal arts now, and we've been asking students about lecturing, and I thought that the students would all say it's dead, and one student after another talks about things they do get out of seeing somebody in front of them, and as with Eric Mazur, being able to interact with them. So maybe we're not going to be completely extinct. But no, I couldn't agree more with what Eric says. And of course, he's changed the way people teach physics very widely.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, and I absolutely can identify with that. I mean, I have not been a college professor for very long, but the way I teach on the undergraduates is very different from the way I was taught as an undergraduate. And so while I'm teaching a large lecture class, I encourage my students to have their laptops open because we have a back channel going so that they're writing collective notes together and also talking about and asking each other questions about my lecture. And also I give them open book quizzes, and it forces me to really come up with some thoughtful questions, because if they can get any facts from anywhere, really the onus is on me to come up with some interesting questions to really get them thinking and processing and synthesizing those facts.
Good evening. My name is Joan Connor, and my question is in regards to the dark aspect of social media, in that it kind of promotes a mob mentality sometimes, and the way that people can hide their identity and maybe target individuals and the effect on psyche that it may induce. And I wanted to know if you feel as if digital citizenship should begin to be included in the curriculum, and what is your text say on that?
Well, that's exactly the focus of our other project called the Good Play Project. And our dear friend and colleague, Carrie James, has a book coming out soon from MIT Press called The Digital Disconnect, I think. And it reports on our research in the area of how young people's moral and ethical sensibilities are affected by their online activities. And one of the results of that line of research is that we collaborated with a nonprofit education group in the Bay Area called Common Sense Media, and they developed a digital citizen curriculum that is very much founded on our research and our theoretical framework. And it's being used in classrooms across the country to really incorporate and encourage digital citizenship. And it seems to be that the idea of digital citizenship is being taken up in many different schools. It's certainly not, it's definitely kind of an add-on still in schools, but I think teachers, and the teachers that we interact with here at Harvard Project Zero at their summer institutes, they are very much interested in promoting digital citizenship among their students.
I also wanted to know if you believe that creating your online persona affects an individual psychologically, because when you create these internet profiles, you kind of put your best self or what you think is your best self forward, and how does that make you feel as far as self-reflection?
Well, I think, people have always tried to put their best self forward, but as we were saying earlier, when you trawl through Facebook of people you know and also people you don't know, and you see one more perfect than the next, this can be very demoralizing. And as Katie said, kids who spend too much time on Facebook, end up paying a price for it. On the digital citizenship, the interesting discovery that Carrie James writes about in this forthcoming book is there's really nobody to model digital citizenship, and so we have to construct it across the generations. It's not like we have, tremendous adult models, and that's because it's a new technology where the adults are more immigrants than the young kids.
Facebook feels like an heir to the class notes, if you ever get those from college. Everybody writes in when they get married, but most people don't write in when they get divorced, so it feels like that kind of curated self, right? So let's take one more question here.
I lucked out. I have two things. One, the first is a point that I want to make about the question of meditation and its effect on the brain that I think was briefly touched on, and that is that Professor Richard Davidson at the University of Wisconsin and other psychologists involved in the Mind and Life Institutes, sponsored by the Dalai Lama, are right up that alley. The most recent one of the Mind and Life Institutes is currently being held, or was just held, in Dharamsala, India, and dealt with addiction and such issues. Okay, so that's a point. The question that I wanted to ask was on the digital divide. And I'm a public school educator from 1975 until currently, and I am at least bewildered, if not more, by the relatively scant attention given to the differential resources going to children in this country. The disparity between the wealthiest and the least wealthy children in this society has continued to increase at an alarming rate, and not very much was said about that today. I believe that a University of Chicago book was published this week or last week that dealt with the promises of public versus private education. But living in this neighborhood, sometimes one wonders if there is such a thing as public education. Just saying.
Well, this is something that I'm really concerned with, and it's a focus of a current research study I have going on in Providence, Rhode Island. But there is a huge disparity, and a lot of it has to do with how public schools are set up, and in order to get federal funding, to get E-rate funding for technology, they have to show that they're protecting their students, and so they block a lot of sites, Facebook and YouTube. But of course, YouTube is a tremendous educational tool. And so and then often the kids in public schools tend to be on average lower income than the kids in private schools. And so school is their only place where they have internet access or access to any sort of high-speed technology. And so, but if at school everything is blocked and at home they don't have internet access, and their parents aren't online or on Facebook to help them, support them, and show them how to use these technologies well and responsibly, then you have this divide.
I just want to add a suggestion for you. If you want to broaden your research base in Seattle to the public schools and to a more multi-ethnic and multicultural population, you might try Bailey Gatzert Elementary School, which is where the homeless population primarily attends, and maybe kids from 30 different countries and language groups, or Madrona Elementary. Both of those are Seattle public schools.
Thank you. Well, absolutely. And it's funny, so right now a lot of my research is in Bermuda, which is highly diverse, but also on the East Coast in Providence, Rhode Island. So I don't necessarily always research in my own backyard, but often I do. Yeah.
So one final question for me, which now we go from the low income to the high income here. There was an article, it must have been more than a year ago in the New York Times about the Waldorf School in the Bay Area, where a lot of tech executives working at eBay and Google send their children. And the remarkable thing about the school was they didn't allow technology. And not that those children did not know how to be on a computer. Now, what do the executives at those places know about technology that makes that a smart decision, or is it that not a smart decision? Are they being overly cautious?
Oh, I don't actually, I mean, I've heard about that too. I can't really speak to their motivation, but those kids are not deprived. That's what I would say. No, I think any parent, any educational system is being derelict if, as Katie said, and the most recent questioner pointed out, that kids aren't exposed to both digital devices and the most important sites. I think that's essential now, and I don't believe, in the no-pad kind of parental view, but Waldorf education tends to go to people who have the privilege of having the stuff at home, so they can afford to have that kind of education. My guess, without knowing nothing, and so I better turn it over to Katie, is it's because they think Waldorf education is a good education. I don't think that they think they do it because they're technologically wary, but I don't actually know.
Well, is Waldorf smart? And either of you can answer this, but is Waldorf smart to separate kids from their devices for, let's say, 7 hours a day?
I see no particular cost to that, because when they go home and they want to do it, they can do it. And if the parents said go completely cold turkey, I wouldn't be in favor of that, except for limited periods of time. Ariana Huffington said in the future, people will pay money to go to places where you can't have any of your devices. I don't know whether that's true yet.
I think people already are. I think they seek out vacation spots where they're not reachable. But as for the Waldorf question, I'm not sure. I'm not sure where I stand on that, actually. I can see that those parents can offer their children highly sophisticated experiences with technology and support at home, and so they don't feel the need to have that at school. But I also do recognize that if we're going to be in a society that is infused with technology, young people need to know how to work with that technology. But if it's taken care of at home, then I guess there's no downside.
Katie Davis, Howard Gardner, thank you very much. A for NPR. You've been listening to a program of Cambridge Forum recorded in November 2013, co-sponsored by the First Parish Church in Cambridge, Unitarian Universalist, the Lowell Institute, and the Friends of Cambridge Forum. For information about this forum entitled The App Generation, featuring Howard Gardner and Katie Davis, or about our podcasts and webcasts, visit us at cambridgeforum.org in Harvard Square. I'm Kara Miller. Thanks for joining us. Thanks.
Okay, that was for the radio audience, and this is for you. The books are